Hi, everyone. Me and Helleborn are going to be doing a book review today, and it's going to be about Red Sky at Noon. This is a historical novel that, had many surface similarity to our friend Tete's 70 Fierce Years, since it takes place in the same timeline and has many Cossack characters. However, there are major differences in how the author, Montefiore, approaches historical subjects and characters versus how Tete, I, and Helleborn approach our historical characters and stories.
Indeed, and I'm really looking forward to discussing it with you. So, Red Sky at Noon is a novel published in 2017. Imprisoned in the gulags for a crime he did not commit, Benya Golden joins a penal battalion made up of Cossacks and convicts to fight the Nazis. He enrolls in the Russian cavalry, and on a hot summer day in July 1942, he and his band of brothers are sent on a suicide mission behind enemy lines. But is there a traitor among them? The only thing Benya can trust is his horse, Silver Socks, and that he will find no mercy in onslaught of Hitler's troops as they push east. Spanning 10 epic days between Benya's war on the grasslands of southern Russia and Stalin's intrigues in the Kremlin, between Benya's intense affair with an Italian nurse and a romance between Stalin's daughter and a war correspondent, this is a sweeping story of passion, bravery, and survival, where betrayal is a constant companion, death just a heartbeat away, and love, however fleeting, offers a glimmer of redemption.
Perfect. And these are the questions that Helleborn's going to be asking me. So number one is, what prompted me to read the book? And then what are the pros of this book? What are the flaws of this book? How was the romance? Why did I not like it? Why was Benya an unappealing protagonist? And finally, how can historical fiction be written better? As you can kind of sense by the questions, I and Tete were not very satisfied with the book, and Helleborn is going to witness for the first time how some passages are written, and she is going to see for herself why we didn't really like certain things in this book.
I cannot wait to do this. So first, what prompted you to read this book?
So me and Tete were traveling in Ottawa, Ontario last month when we saw a bunch of books on discount at Chapters Indigo. This one was only $4, and it was, a very large book, around 400 pages, and it was hardcover, and the setting reminded us a lot about Tete's novel, 70 Fierce Years, which is about a Cossack who loses a lot in his life after the Russian Revolution. Naturally, this really made us thought of how this book could be used as inspiration for her writing, so she decided to buy it. I didn't buy it because I was already carrying too many things and my back was already starting to hurt from all the things we were carrying. So I only came to bought it after I came back home. So I ordered it online, and it was still on discount when I ordered it online. It was only $8.
Wow, that's great. So, right. So, at first, you wanted to see whether it has things in common with Tete's novel, both being about Cossacks.
Exactly. And how war and also prison, because Andre went to prison too, remember? And Benya, the novel starts with him being in prison. So there's a lot of detail about, how prison life is like. And that was very inspirational. So, we did think this was going to be a great novel.
But it wasn't really, right? Why? What are the flaws of this book?
So before I dive into the flaws, I'm going to talk about the pros because Montefiore did do a very good job at these. So because he is a historian and primarily a nonfiction writer, we can really see that he put a lot of effort into the historical research. As Tete and I noticed when browsing through the book at Chapters Indigo, there was a lot of historical details about prison life and, these really small details about how the army operated, and more details about army ranks and different statutes and stuff about how people who were in prison, like the Cossacks and convicts, could gain freedom if they joined a penal battalion. So this is not a very well-known part of history for most people, so it is fascinating to learn about these small things.
That's right. It is. It is. So, how are these things presented in the novel?
The beginning was quite strong. Like, you really got a sense of action and that death was very close. Like as you described, death is just a heartbeat away. You really feel a sense of tension, especially the first chapter. And, it makes you want to learn more about Benya, even though, the beginning is scarce on details about who he is and why he's in prison, but you want to learn more. Unfortunately, as I will cover later on, you only get to know more about Benya's past and even his personality, like at least 200 pages into the book when he falls in love with Fabiana. So that's something I didn't like. Like, the only detail about his personality and who he is as an individual, not just the role he plays, only comes up when he quote unquote falls in love with someone who he barely has any connection with. It just feels so random.
I see. So it's quite difficult to connect with this protagonist if it takes so long for us to understand what kind of a person he is, right? So does it feel a bit in the beginning like he is just any other Kazakh? Would you say that? Is he a bit of an everyman or?
I will cover that just after I cover this, but he is not quite an everyman, but in other aspects, I think he is quite an everyman. So the first thing we see, this is one of the first pages of the book where, Montefiore has included fragments of some of the research he's done. And this is something that Benya always says, my name is nothing. My surname is nobody. It's because he is a political prisoner he was accused of a crime he didn't do. And he was sent to the gulag for that because he was involved with certain people who were political and trying to overthrow Stalin. So then he got kind of captured and then the crime was pinned on him, even though he didn't do anything. So that's how he ended up in the gulags. And he doesn't want people to know about the past. So he tells people his name is nothing because he doesn't want people to know he was imprisoned for being political, because in prison, there is a hierarchy of who is the top dog in prison. So convicts are actually near the top, but then people who committed crimes against Stalin and all the other political reasons are at the bottom. So that's why he doesn't want to tell people his name. So they will never figure out that he is at the bottom of the hierarchy for being accused of trying to betray Stalin.
Okay, I
Yeah.
see. Wow, this is really interesting because I, for one, had no idea that there was such a hierarchy.
Yeah. So there's a lot of fascinating details here. And Order 222, it is time to finish retreating, not one step back. Panic mongers and cowards must be exterminated on the spots. These are the orders of our motherland. Military councils of the fronts and the front commanders should form within each front 1 to 3 penal battalions, 800 persons, where officers and soldiers who have been guilty of a breach of discipline due to cowardice or panic will be assigned and placed at the most difficult sectors of the front to give them an opportunity to redeem their sins by blood. And this is what, Stalin said in 1942. And at the bottom is a Cossack song that Montefiore has found, to inspire his Cossack characters. So a Cossack rode to a distant land, riding his horse over the steppe, his home village he left. He'll never come back again because, a lot of them unfortunately died in the war.
I see. I see. Yeah, this is beautiful and it's quite visual. And I love that my name is nothing, my surname is nobody.
Mm-hmm. And it really does create a sense of, you wanting to know more about Benya because, it's almost like you're one of those prisoners who want to know why Benya is there, but you don't know. Unfortunately, as we previously touched upon, there's many flaws that make us not want to care the further you get into the book.
Wow. So what are the flaws that really struck you while reading this novel?
Number one was the romance, which was much worse than I expected. I didn't have high hopes for the romance, unfortunately, because a lot of romance in novels is not well done, especially historical. A lot of romance in historical novels is not realistic. And a lot of the times it feels like it's just there for the sake of being there.
I see. And especially as you mentioned that the character is not really, we don't get to connect with it as with the character, with the person as readers, then why do we really care about his romance, right?
Exactly.
And also, you said that the novel spans 10 days. How does he get to fall in love in 10 days? I mean, less than 10 days, because I imagined he doesn't meet the woman he falls in love with from the first day, right?
Okay, so basically, I thought they would at least interact for 5 days, but it turns out they only interact for like 2 days or three at most.
But it's a great love between them, right?
Exactly.
Do we get a sense of that? I mean, do they have things in common?
You will see that. It's kind of cheesy. Like he says that he has things in common with her because, even though he's a Russian Jew, apparently he had enough money to travel in Italy before the war. I don't know how, because back then it was hard for people to travel, but he did. And apparently he dined with like these rich intellectuals, and now he knows how to speak Italian. So he tries to impress her, like, during those 3 days with his Italian. And she's like, wow, how does, a Russian Jew know my language and all of this sort of stuff? And I'm like, I guess it's a connection, but it's weird. And then the author, he's saying that, he unfortunately does do that sometimes where he explains instead of shows. So he just summarizes an interaction. He says, oh, wow. For example, Fabiana, who was the Italian nurse, had never met such a sensitive and caring man before. Her husband didn't really ever listen to her and only beat her. And that's supposed to tell us that, these two are growing closer, but he doesn't show enough, of the actual dialogue. Like he just summarizes it like that.
Oh, I see. I Yes, I'm imagining that this is because there is not enough space in the novel given to the romance, right? Because it's mostly focused on the war and on the action and on the historical setting. So I guess the romance is somehow left aside and at the same time pushed in the novel because things don't have to always be grim in a novel, right? So just for the sake
Exactly.
of it, like you said, this is how it
Exactly.
feels to me from your description.
We're going to go over the excerpts very soon when I say why I didn't like the romance. And character development, as we talked about, the characters weren't developed enough because it's only 10 days. And unfortunately, we don't even learn anything about the protagonist, like about his personality, until page 200. So it's already half of the novel. We don't even know who he really is. We just know that he's in the war and, death is just a minute away or something. But I mean, who cares if I don't even know who he is, right?
That's true. So I think that in the beginning we were supposed to learn more about the character. I mean, sure, you have to show the setting and you have to give the reader this impression of the impending doom, right? But I think this had to be blended with descriptions of the characters, thought processes, and maybe memories or something that gives us a sense of who he is and how he personally interprets war and not how every other soldier does.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So one of the problems is that there are some flashbacks, but there's not enough. So they do happen, but it always feels very brushed over. Like it's a quick summary of his childhood that takes like one paragraph. And I think there should be more of these to give us a better idea of who he is and also his personality, not just a laundry list of what happened, in his childhood or as a young man.
Definitely, yeah. Maybe some flashbacks would have helped. So actual scenes where we can see him really interacting. Because I imagine that in war scenes, in fight scenes, we don't get to see a lot of personality, right? Because people
Mm-hmm.
have to do certain things to survive. So these extreme situations don't show a lot about the individuality of a person.
Yeah, for the first 200 pages, we do get little glimpses of Benya's character, but it's just him being scared of war because he's never been to war before. And also these memories he has of his father telling him to stop flirting with women because he's obsessed with womanizing. And that's it. Like, those are the only two things we know about him.
Oh, I guess that also foreshadows that he is going to have a love interest and she's going to love him because ladies love him, right?
Yeah, exactly. And he's always thinking about his mistress, the one who was a spy. So because of his relationship with her, he was, put into the gulags for her crimes too. So he doesn't even say that she's a spy until the last like 20 pages or something. It's at the very end, but her name just keeps on appearing, Sashenka. And he's just like, oh, she was so sensual. She was just so amazing in bed. Like every time her name appears, it's just him thinking about her body and how amazing she was, sexually. I'm just like, okay.
Okay, I don't really see how it's relevant, but I guess people in war sometimes get to remember these things as the best things in life that they are missing because they have to fight. So maybe this is why it keeps coming up in his thoughts.
Yes, so I will talk more about that when we talk about the Benya, but we will talk about the romance now. So I didn't like it because it was trite, boring, and just thrown in there for the sake of having romances. The characters weren't developed enough for the romances to be interesting or substantial, and some of it didn't make sense, especially given what's at stake and how many of the characters involved are fully grown people who should know better. So besides Benya and Fabiana, there is another couple. It's Lev, the war correspondent, and Svetlana, who is Stalin's daughter. And Lev is a 40-year-old man, while Svetlana is only 16. But Svetlana falls in love with him after reading his coverage of the war, and then she decides to meet up with him. And this is how they fall in love. I will show you the excerpts, but it's very lame. And Lev is a war correspondent who's 40 years old. So shouldn't he know the consequences of being involved with Stalin's daughter? Because, I mean, there would be consequences because he would be seen as, trying to do something because, people would be very protective of the fact that she is Stalin's daughter. And same with Fabiana. She is a nurse who is 35 years old, which was considered kind of old back then and even now to a certain degree, especially when you're thinking about someone who has this sort of duty on her shoulders, to be supportive of her own nation in war. She should know the consequences of running off with the enemy, which Benya was, even if she was quote unquote in love with him, even though she had only talked to him for a while and he was only showing off his Italian skills. And apparently he was a good listener and he didn't beat her. So that's enough for her to fall in love with him after a few hours.
Wow. Yeah, that's true because these people are very mature. I mean, in any time at 35, you're supposed to have yourself pretty much figured out, right? And that's true when you have lived such trying experiences as she did. Yeah, sure. I mean, you're supposed to know these things, right? And also they really fall in love quickly. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just not a romantic person, but I don't really imagine at my age, because I guess I'm the same age as Fabiana, falling in love with someone after a few hours. Falling in love with any man who doesn't beat me.
I know. And he speaks a few Italian phrases and he says, oh, well, I had, this amazing coffee with this intellectual in Rome back in 1938. And that's supposedly is so amazing. And that makes her fall in love with him. What the hell?
I was thinking that Italian is a sexy language. So maybe this is why. But then this is her language, right? So why is this so impressive to her? She has heard men speaking Italian for so long. So what is it about this guy in particular?
Because he's a foreigner and he's on the opposite side of the war and she didn't expect it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I definitely cannot relate to this. I don't imagine falling in love with someone just because he knows a few words in my language. So
Exactly. It's so forced. So
I
here are
guess the guy is really charming because we were told that he has a way with women. We don't see it, but we
we
are
don't
told
see
that he
it. That's the
does.
thing. We
Maybe
don't
he's
see
really
it.
handsome.
He's very skinny. Like he's a very frail, 45-year-old man who looks really, really tired. And he also looks weak because he's been starved in the gulags.
Oh my God. Yeah, I know. I just thought that maybe he was really handsome, like this dashing guy who just looks at you, and you forget everything else. But then, oh, and he's also older than she is. So, okay, right.
Yeah, all of the men in this book are older. Like Lev is 40 and Benya's 45.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I
Yeah.
see. Maybe the ladies here don't have high standards, I guess.
I don't think they do. And here's to illustrate that, here is Svetlana, who is Stalin's daughter, and Lev, her love interest. This is the first time they meet at a party. So this is Lev, a tall man in an army uniform with a thick shock of gray streaked black hair and intense dark eyes, was talking to a group of women who were intensely listening to him. Svetlana would always remember that his hand was raised in a fist with one hand pointing to make his point. He put his arm around Vasily. Liv Shapiro, this is my sister Svetlana, Vasily said. I hope she doesn't bore you. She's very serious. Shapiro looked down at her, and in that moment, Svetlana felt tiny and ugly and very young. The women turned up to her with their scarlet lips, curled hair, and black made-up eyes, and they seemed irresistible, carefree, and sophisticated. But to her amazement, Shapiro left them without a word and led her aside. And then he talks about how the letter she sent to him, thanking him for his correspondence, made his day. And then he's like, this is why I wrote back. And then later on, they laughed with mouths open as if they already knew each other. Aren't we lions? He said. Okay, that was random. Yes, she said, that's your name, because Lev means lion in Russian. And it will be your name too. I am going to call you Lizveta. May I, lioness? Yes, oh yes. He looked at her very closely. You have something sad in your eyes. Do you want to tell me about it? It was the strangest thing, Svetlana thought later. He had just met her and he saw right into her heart. It was the greatest secret in her life, and this man, whom she had known for a minute, seemed to know about it. Now, what do you think?
Wow. Okay. So, well, she did know him in a way, right? In the beginning. I mean, she was the one who contacted him. So I guess maybe she already had some expectations of him. But, what did he exactly see in her? Because we aren't really told. I mean, it seems like he's just flirting with a young woman, with a girl, So, and also she seems really unassuming, the way she compares herself with other women. So I don't know. I imagined that she would be a different kind of person being Stalin's daughter, but I guess, she had some father issues, I imagine.
I think she does, yeah. And unfortunately, what happens to Lev at the end is that he gets sent to a gulag because Stalin got sick of him, and he was interfering with his daughter. And he's like, "What are you trying to do? Are you trying to get married to my daughter so you can, get a higher position in government?" So he doesn't like him, and he sends him away. But I mean,
Yeah,
shouldn't
I mean,
Lev
I'm
have
sure that,
predicted that,
yeah.
because he is a grown man, he does political things, so he should
Mhm.
realize that he shouldn't have ever talked to Stalin's daughter, because that would be a possible consequence.
Well, maybe he just wanted to be bold and rebellious and just didn't care about what was going on. I mean, I'm sure that he knew it. It wouldn't make sense that he didn't, but maybe it was just a choice he made because he really fell in love. And in a minute, it's described here. And love makes people do stupid things.
Yeah, that's the thing, because it's a minute. It's not like it was developed over a realistic period of time.
I know.
That's the problem. And here's a Benya and Fabiana, and it's very cringe. This is when Fabiana runs away with Benya just because she can, because she's sick of her husband died because Benya accidentally killed him when he was fighting him. So then she became a widow overnight, and then right after that, she met Benya, who was injured in the war. But somehow the Italians thought he was on their side because there was a contingent of Cossacks who betrayed Stalin, and they actually joined the fascists. So somehow they thought he was one of those people who betrayed Stalin, and they brought him back. And then she started helping him with the medical stuff. And then only later she found out that he didn't actually betray Stalin. So, he's still on the communist side. And this is when she decides to run away with him just because she can. And she's like, oh, this man understands me, back home, no one ever did. So this is what they think about running away. It was then that she knew what the intensity of the battle meant for them. Benya was risking his own life for her happiness, sacrificing it for something that could only be horribly short-lived. She should return to her people. She knew she could persuade Malamore she was innocent to call off his pursuit, and she would make it home to Venice. But every day, Benya lingered with her, and there would be fewer Russians at the site of this dawn. Soon, there would be none, and it would be impossible for Benya to get back to the Soviet side. Malamore was chasing Benya because of her, and if they caught her with him, a Jew, they would kill him. If he was ever seen with her by his own side, she would be I cannot see because my head, she would be the death sentence of the man who had shown her the secret of passion itself.
Okay, the last sentence was quite cringy. Sorry.
I know. And she says, darling Benya, she whispers, I've decided. You were right. I must go back. Don't try to dissuade me now. It is decided. He did not reply for a long time. Then he sighed, knowing now how sometimes men perished because they were too weary to go on. It's too late. It's too dark now to do anything. I think we bandits in love must stay together, somehow forever. And for us, forever means now. No one will find us here. Let's decide what to do in the morning.
Okay, well, I guess that maybe the one reason why they fall in love so quickly is that, as it says here, they know they don't have a lot of time. So why not do something, pleasurable in the days they may have, because anything can happen to them. So maybe this also points to the sense of urgency, because otherwise I don't see how outside of these extreme situations people can really fall in love with someone they don't even know over shallow things to bond them. So maybe it has to do with the extreme situation they're in, right?
That's true.
Yes. So that could be an explanation.
That could be. Do you think they're more convincing than Lev and Svetlana? Or are they equally both unconvincing?
Well, I have no idea, because I don't think I can go beyond the age difference. I mean, at least, especially from Svetlana's point of view. So how gorgeous was the man that she really fell in love with him after 1 minute? So really, did she lead such a terrible and sad and lonely life until 16 that nobody ever cared that she was sad, that she has to fall in love with someone so old compared to her? So I think that was more unrealistic, because I really don't see and you said that she's not really set up as a character before this. So we don't see why she has been so sad and lonely. It just says in that one sentence, right, that nobody knew her like he did in 1 minute or something. So I don't know, maybe if we had seen her up to that point leading this really lonely life full of neglect, then maybe we would understand why she latched on to the first man who, gave her the time of day. But
you do have a point. Actually, before this, there was one chapter where she talked about how her mother died. She actually committed suicide, but she doesn't find out until later. And how, her father keeps a close eye on who befriends her. So she ends up being very lonely because he doesn't want her to be too close to anyone in case they want to infiltrate his family or, kidnap her or something. So this is one of the reasons why she feels lonely. But as to why she picks him in particular, it's strange because, like I said, she never saw him in real life before. She only, opened the newspaper and then she saw that he wrote weekly stories about the war. And somehow his description of the war really struck her as amazing. So that's why she reached out to him. And then she got her brother, who knows him, to put her in contact with him. And that's how they met in person.
yeah, I do feel it's a bit forced. I mean, especially because of the age difference.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really find it realistic that a girl that age would really latch on to a much older man that she has never seen before. I mean, sure, I do understand the admiration, but doesn't this have to rely on more than just reading some articles written by that person? I mean, do you really fall in love with someone based on a few articles?
Exactly. And it's just, I guess she could be she could admire his writing style, but what does that have to do with her wanting to actually seek him out and talk to him in person? That's quite a leap.
Yeah, and even if she did want to do this, how does she get to a romantic and I assume sexual relationship with him? I mean, you can admire a writer and not, automatically want to have a relationship of that kind with him.
Exactly. That was very forced to me.
Yeah, maybe it should have been explained more, but I'm not sure. Maybe if they had much more time to really bond with each other, then maybe it could lead to that. But as it is, in 1 minute, I really don't find that realistic.
And I can't believe he actually wrote it out in a minute. Like, that is just ridiculous. No offense. And here's an excerpt from Benya and Fabiana, how he talks to her with random Italian phrases. I have to read this out loud. It's too funny.
I want to see it.
Okay, so this is what Fabiana says. How about you mind your own problems? And this is when he's a patient because he's injured and they picked him up. And then he says, am I an impertinent patient? She says, the worst so far. And he says, I'm just a curioso. He thought for a moment. I don't know your name. Nurse Basigulupe, she said coolly. Are you thirsty? She gave him water. Hungry? Very. What do you have? And then he lists out the names of these dishes. And then she says, you know some Italian? Maybe you've been there? And he nodded. Stop showing off. You need to rest or I'll have to leave. What? And send back that crocodile to finish me off? What about the food? Is that ever coming?
Wow. Okay. So he's not even really saying things in Italian. It's just food. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people know the names of Italian dishes in Italian, and I'm not sure an Italian would be that impressed with this. I mean, I actually visited Italy this year, and I tried to make a bit of conversation with people in Italian, like in stores or in taxis. And I really doubt that anyone fell in love with me for trying to say a sentence in Italian.
And he even says a swear word or something, and she's like, hey, don't swear to me in that Roman dialect. I'm Venetian.
Wow. So, why was Benya an unappealing protagonist?
I think there's two major points as to why, as I previously covered. The first one is I think he was created primarily for the concept. So the concept of his character is a Russian Jewish intellectual slash former teacher who and writer was imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, and he has to fight for his freedom by joining a penal battalion of convicts and Cossacks. So he's like a fish out of water because, first of all, he never committed any crimes. He's not a Cossack, but he finds himself in a gulag, and now to get his freedom, he has to join forces with other prisoners who are convicts and Cossacks, to fight the Nazis.
I see. So you think he is quite generic?
I think he is defined by his role, like as someone who went to the gulag and now he has to fight to earn his freedom, rather than as a personality or as, an individual. So he's more of a concept. And in that way, we don't really get to see what his personality traits are, other than, being flirtatious with women like Sashenka and Fabiana. And the fact that he used to be an intellectual who traveled to Italy, and he even went to Spain, and he wrote a book about the fascism in Spain or something. So like this is a man who has been all over the place. And, of course, he was flirting with women in all of those countries.
Okay, I see. so that's one of the main points about his personality, his main personality traits.
Exactly. And he's also very scared. Like every time someone tells him to do something in war, I mean, it's understandable because he's never been in war, but then it makes you wonder, why is his primary character trait in war just total and paralyzing fear? I mean, there should be some other traits shown too. And sometimes it doesn't make sense because, he kills someone and then he feels terror and then guilt. And then, the next scene shows like his Cossack teammates suddenly killing a random guy on their side just because he's a bully or something. And then he just describes, okay, and that person died. And then he feels a little weird and he describes it to someone else, but he doesn't feel traumatized by it. So one minute he's traumatized by a very gory scene, and then suddenly he's not traumatized, just like one scene later.
I see. Okay, so is the fear, would you say, his main flaw? If you consider it a flaw, I mean, of course, he in order for him to have a solid personality, he'd have to have both positive and negative traits. So this is one of his flaws, right?
I think so, yes. And uncertainty in war, and I guess not being a warrior, because in war you sort of have to be a warrior, and he lacks that. And also the fact that he's physically frail, since he's 45 years old, malnutrition, and extremely skinny.
I see. And also he was an intellectual, so presumably he wasn't much of a sportsman, for example.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that's interesting because we are usually expecting to see in a war novel a great hero, right? A really heroic character who just goes into battle and isn't afraid of anything, and who has high ideals and fights for ideals. So I think this is one of the things that makes him, I guess, stand out. Of course, he's not the only character with these traits in literature, but this is quite interesting because it is a contrast from what you might expect. But, of course, this depends a lot on how it is illustrated in the novel.
Exactly. And I think one of the problems is the lack of consistency. For example, like I said, with the whole seeing death and having different reactions to it. The first reaction to it was well described. It was very realistic because the first people he killed was two young Italian men. And this is a little bit of foreshadowing with what later happens to Fabiana, because he hears them cry out for their mothers when he kills them. And he's like, oh no, they're speaking Italian, one of my favorite languages. And then he suddenly has these flashbacks of his travels in Italy. And then he feels bad because he loved Italy so much when he went there. And now he has to kill people from that nation.
Oh, I see. Yeah, this is interesting.
Yeah. But then unfortunately, I think after that, it just got very boring. Like, I mean, like I said, the beginning is solid, but as you go through the novel, there's almost like it's just a lot of repetition, not even that much gore sometimes, like just like stuff about them sneaking around and then like the Cossacks joking about some random thing and calling him old man and stuff like that. And it just becomes very repetitive. And, there's always a betrayal happening. Some random person goes to the other side, even though they thought he was going to help them and that sort of stuff. So, yeah, I guess it's just hard to really enjoy the character in the story because it feels like he's not really the focus sometimes. It's like the plot twist is the focus. Like, oh, you didn't expect this person to be a betrayer, or you didn't expect, this evil Nazi to suddenly show up.
Yeah, I see. I think this happens in a lot of war novels. Is just war scenes that are not directly connected to the inner plot, so to speak, of the main character. So if you take those away, the novel pretty much stays the same.
Exactly. Right. And yeah, like I said, his main character development as a person only took place after he met Fabiana. And that's when we actually see more of his dialogue. Like, I mean, in the past, we of course see him speak when he's in prison, but it's always very limited. It's like him answering basic questions and, talking about how, it's unfair he's here and, just taking orders from people. And it's only when he meets Fabiana, he starts showing off his flirty personality, which is his primary trait, right? And now we learn that he is a well-traveled man who speaks multiple languages and has a romantic, idealistic mindset. But even then, this feels, I think, very two-dimensional.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So what do you think could be changed in the book? How can you write historical fiction in a way that is more interesting and not as repetitive?
I think I think we should just choose one genre. So like if it's primarily action, it would be better if it was just focused on the action, so less character focused. But then when you put romance, you have to make the characters more fleshed out for the romance to be convincing. So I think what should have been done here, since this was primarily an action novel, it should have been just focused on like the history and the action, not and remove the romance.
Okay, so removing the romance would make the story a better one, right? Because it would be more, I guess, consistent.
Yes, definitely.
Okay,
Yes.
I see. So what else do you think?
I think another thing is that they should also balance historical facts with character psychology, right? So if you want to make a balanced character that's developed, you should also include more of the person and what their thoughts and emotions are like and their speech patterns too, rather than just list out he was born here and this is what his parents did and this is what his profession was before the war. It doesn't feel personalized. It just feels like, yes, this is what this person was. It almost feels like a Wikipedia article.
It feels like a summary of the character, not exactly a narrative of the protagonist, of what he is about, and not necessarily the external action around him.
Exactly. Yeah. And finally, don't just include themes like romance for the sake of having it. And I think it has to do with the fact that many publishers and authors think a book must have romance to be attractive to readers.
I know. This is a huge trope because a lot of people feel like this. But yeah, you're right. I was never a big fan of romance for the sake of it. So I don't expect to read about romance in every book. Of course, it can really enhance the novel, but only if it makes sense within the story, if it actually brings something new to the characters, and if it is realistic and if it evolves in a realistic way. And like you said, the characters have to really be fleshed out before we care about who they fall in love with.
Exactly. Like when it just becomes like a paint by numbers. Okay, my novel has, 10 action scenes. Now we have to have 2 romance scenes. That's not okay. Like usually when people do that, it turns out bad.
That's true. I really agree. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think this novel wants to be a bit of both. It wants to be action and it wants to be romance. But unless you want the novel to be like 1,000 pages long, that's very hard to do.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And also, another thing that I noticed from what you said, do you think that it could have been better structured, I guess? So the emphasis placed on things that are more relevant to the plot and not just random war scenes, would you say?
I think so. Yes. And there's way too many random details too. There's this part where Fabiana and Benya, they when they're like, bandits in love and they're like running away from everyone else, they run into this old woman and then she has a prophecy and then something about a child. And as it turns out, Fabiana later gets pregnant with Benya's child after he has to go back to Russia and they never see each other again, except for this one tiny thing at the very end. But at the very end of the novel, so the only reason why this prophecy exists is just to have that tiny scene at the end of the novel where Benya sees the prisoners of war being released after the war, and some of them include Fabiana and a little girl who is his daughter. And he looks at her for a split second, and the little girl looks at him, and he's like, "Oh, so that's what the old woman was talking about. This is the child she saw in her vision, his daughter." And
Oh,
that's
I
it.
see. So
Yeah.
that's mainly for the protagonist to figure out that the girl is his
Yeah. Like there's
in
no
the
purpose
prophecy.
of that scene other than that.
Because of course the reader already knows that. So it was mainly for the protagonist, as I understand it.
Um,
Or the reader finds out at the same time as the protagonist.
yes, a little bit
Mhm.
like that. I
Okay,
think we
I
kind of sense it a little bit because of how he describes the girl. So even before the sentence, he says, "Oh, he thinks
Mhm.
about the prophecy." He's like, "That girl has the same eyes as him and his same smile." So I'm like, "Oh, so this is his daughter."
Okay, I see. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it just feels like a random thing that was just put in for no reason.
So, how does this compare to Tete's novel? Because you said in the beginning that it reminded you both of her book, 70 Fierce Years.
Katete's novel is definitely different in terms of focus because it's about one man's journey told from his first person perspective, Andre, right? So Benya's story is told in third person, and it almost feels like he's a minor character compared to the events. The events seem like the main character. So we never get to see how his thoughts are like or his stream of consciousness. But for Andre, because he is in first person and he is in control of his narrative, we can see how his thoughts are like, how his dialogue is like, and how he interacts with people. So he comes to life while Benya does not come to life.
Oh, I see what you mean. What about the romance? Because there is some romance in Tete's novel as well.
Yes. So the romance in Teti's novel is different also because there is a buildup. So after Andre is sent to well, not the gulag, but like he is sent to the prison, because he was on the wrong side of the war. He was the
Mhm.
whites. So he was anti-communist and he was betrayed by the communists and sent to the prison. After he comes out from that, a friend arranges for him to stay with a prostitute, Tamara, who later becomes his love interest. And at the first, they don't really get along that well, especially since he has a lot of emotional problems due to being in prison and all the things he saw in war. So he doesn't trust her and they kind of clash, but they eventually build a friendship. And from there, they fall in love. So it's not like, Svetlana just seeing Lev for the first time and falling in love with him, in a minute.
I see. Yeah, that there really is a buildup, and then it's also more realistic that someone who has been through a lot of trauma doesn't immediately fall madly in love with the first woman he sees, right? So, I mean, to me, it really does sound more realistic. And I see what you mean with the critique that you brought to how Montefiore did the romance part of his novel.
Exactly. Right. And it's an interesting point of comparison also how Benya is also someone who went to prison, and also he went through war and he did a lot of terrible things and saw a lot of terrible things, including killing people viciously. But yes, he is traumatized when he does it. But by the time he meets Fabiana, all of that instantly evaporates and he just becomes so happy go lucky. Like he never saw all the terrible things that happened in the first 200 pages of the novel.
I see. So it's not really consistent, and this is what kind of spoils the realism of the character's personality.
Exactly, because he was almost dead when they found him, and he's in enemy territory. Does he still have the energy or the mood to suddenly talk about his travels in Italy and start randomly putting Italian words in his speech to impress her? It just feels like it's not appropriate for the situation.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess it makes sense that people would cling on to any positive thing they feel and any positive experience in that situation. But there should have been more. I mean, all the trauma and all his weariness should not have been set aside, because now it's the romance part. Let's forget about everything else.
That's how I felt. Like the romance part was just this isolated thing. It was like, okay, that's weird. Suddenly now he's in a tent and now the mood changes. It feels like everything has changed because the romance is going to happen. So everything has to change, right? So it's very unrealistic.
Yeah, I really see what you mean. Yes.
Yeah. So in the end, I can't give this book a high rating, unfortunately. I would give it 2 out of 5 stars.
I see. Yeah, it does sound like that to me. And unfortunately, there are a lot of tropes when it comes to historical fiction, and a lot of expectations that both readers and publishers, and I guess also writers, have when it comes to historical fiction, because it is often placed on these big narratives, right? Wars and great external conflict, and then you also have the setting that you have to set up in order to make the reader feel that they are in a different world. So I think that a lot of the times writers overdo this, and in wanting to make it realistic, they place too much emphasis on the setting and on these great events that they want to be happening, and they set aside the realism of the characters, which I think is what makes most people really immerse themselves into a book. And making realistic characters with concerns realistic for their time and their place and the experiences they have is also a form of historical setting, right? Because the character would probably not be the same in a different time, because they do not go through those, and they have a different set of values, outlooks on life, I guess. So I don't think this should be set aside or put to a secondary place.
Absolutely not. And, I think that's something you did really well in your own historical book, Lucky Wolf. All of everything, you can see all of the elements were united. It wasn't like, oh, here's the romance part. Now we're going to just ignore everything else, right?
I see. I did not conceptualize it in that way. It just, I guess, came naturally, because my whole idea, my whole premise was to show two characters, their personalities and their interactions on the backdrop of Norway's conversion to Christianity. So in my mind, that always came second to the characters.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. And I think it also has to do with the genre. I think, your and Tete's historical books, even though they are historical, I think they could be more technically classified as quote unquote literary. I know that is a very broad definition, but usually when people say that, it means that they're not genre fiction. So genre fiction is usually kind of like, sci-fi or like thriller or mystery. Like it's a story written with a specific purpose, with a specific market in mind. So historical fiction is sometimes considered one of these markets. And sometimes I guess people are pressured by their publishers to add certain things to their book to appeal to that market. For example, people like historical fiction, like, something like Bridgerton, you have to have romance in it. So then they pressure you to add romance to it. So it could be a publisher's fault too.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, because it comes with a set of tropes that something that's written in the modern day doesn't really have. And I really don't see why this is happening. I've always found it ridiculous because you don't have to have a reason to write historical fiction. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be set at this fantastic moment in the past, like a world war or something, because people also had so many concerns, just as many as they have nowadays. So you can have this story about, someone remembering his youth, for example, and you can set it in the historical period, right? So if you can do this in our time, why can't you do this in historical times? Why does there always have to be battles and a lot of details about setting sort of like a history lesson, so the reader must come out of that experience knowing a lot about the setting. I mean, sure, you have to understand the setting, but I think that should come naturally. And I'm really not criticizing the war part and the action scenes, because, as you know, I also have a lot of those. So I'm also fascinated with those big narratives, right? I mean, after all, a lot of my historical fiction happens during Norway's conversion to Christianity, but I'm not trying to make a history lesson out of it.
Right. Exactly. I think a lot of historical readers, unfortunately, maybe they are perceived by publishers as wanting to read this kind of stuff. So this is why the publishers push authors to write for this supposed audience.
That's true, but this is a vicious cycle, because then you will only have that kind of audience, and other people who are not really interested in learning something about your chosen setting, then they will say, oh, this is set in, I don't know, the 4th century. I'm not interested in the 4th century, so I'm not going to read this, And also there are so many different settings, and, you're not interested in this part of the world in that particular century, so I'm not going to read this. It's really limiting.
It is very limiting. And I think that's why maybe we could try classifying our works not as historical, because unfortunately historical is being stereotyped as this sort of thing, but as literary or general fiction.
That's true. Yes, definitely. Because unfortunately, like you said, even though it doesn't make a lot of sense, there are these tropes that are pushed onto it.
Right. Well, thank you so much. This was, a really amazing analysis. And I really think we should do more book reviews like this.
I think so too. And thank you for sharing your experiences with this book. It was interesting to learn about it, even though I have not yet read it.
Yes.
So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Goodbye.